The most devastating thing my father ever did to me cost him nothing. It took less than 40 seconds, required no raised voice, no slammed door, and it destroyed 11 years of my life before I understood it was the very thing that would rebuild me. I need you to stay with me on this, because what happened on year 11 will change the way you think about forgiveness forever. I was 22 years old when I mailed the first package. A box the size of a shoebox, wrapped in green craft paper, addressed to 441 Veradero Lane, the house where I grew up. A mustard yellow colonial with a wraparound porch and a rusted weather vane that spun even when the air was perfectly still, as though it was measuring some wind no one else could feel. Inside the box, a cashmere scarf in deep burgundy for my mother, Sorvete, that was our private name for her, the one my brother Kale and I invented when we were 7 and 9, because she smelled like vanilla ice cream every morning before church. And for my father, Drago, a first edition of a Clarice Lispector novel he'd been hunting for 20 years, one I'd found in a musty antiquarian stall in Porto Alegre while I was finishing my last semester at university. I wrapped each item in tissue paper the color of fog. I sealed the box with 2 strips of tape. I wrote the return address carefully. I drove it to the post office on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before Christmas, and I paid for priority shipping because I wanted it to arrive with enough time for them to feel something warm before the holiday. 3 days later, the package came back. No note, unopened. The tape unbroken. Just a single red sticker slapped over my handwriting, the kind the post office uses for returns, except this wasn't a postal return. Someone had physically brought it to a post office and reshipped it to me. And then, a few hours after it landed on my apartment doorstep in Recife, my mother texted me 3 words: "We don't accept." That was it. Not even a full sentence. A fragment. A dismissal so precise it felt surgical. I sat on the floor of my studio apartment, the one with the broken ceiling fan that clicked every 3rd rotation, and I stared at that box for 4 hours. I didn't open it. I didn't throw it away. I just stared at it the way you stare at something that used to make sense and no longer does, like a word you've repeated so many times it loses its shape. Burgundy scarf, first edition, $23 in priority shipping, returned. What had I done? That's the question that would devour the next decade of my life. The estrangement had begun 2 years earlier, when I was 20, over something I still can't fully reduce to a single sentence without distorting it. My father had a brother named Faustino, who was not a kind man. Faustino had built his life on the slow erosion of other people's dignity. Not dramatically, not with violence, but with the particular cruelty of someone who understands exactly where your insecurities live and visits them regularly, the way a neighbor visits to borrow something but never returns it. For years, Faustino had been taking money from my parents. Small amounts at first, then larger. My father knew, I think, on some level, but he chose not to know in the way that people choose blindness when the alternative is too expensive emotionally. My mother was complicit in that silence. When I was 20, I found the bank statements. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a water bill they'd asked me to pay while they were traveling. But there it was, transfer after transfer, always in round numbers, always to the same account. I confronted my father about it on a Sunday afternoon in October, when the light came through the kitchen window at that specific gold angle that makes everything look like it should be photographed. I showed him the statements. I said the words I thought needed to be said. He looked at me the way people look at something that has broken unexpectedly, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted grief. And then he said, "This is not your house to clean." My mother said nothing. She was standing at the sink, washing a single glass that was already clean. Within a week, Faustino had been told what I'd said. Within 2 weeks, Faustino had rewritten the story so thoroughly that I had become the villain, the ungrateful, presumptuous son who'd accused his own family of corruption, who'd disrespected his elders, who'd invented financial wrongdoing out of pride and arrogance. And my parents, caught between the version of me they'd raised and the version Faustino had constructed, chose the version that required less courage to believe. I was asked to leave the house. I left. I built a life in Recife with the particular ferocity of someone who has been told they don't deserve one. I finished university. I found work in logistics, first as a junior analyst, then as something more. I moved into better apartments, then worse ones, then better again, in the oscillating rhythm that defines your 20s when you're doing it without a net. I made friends who became family in the way that chosen family always feels slightly more deliberate and therefore slightly more precious than the inherited kind. I cooked my own Christmas dinners. I bought my own birthday cakes. I learned, slowly and at considerable expense, that grief doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in spirals, so that every time you think you've passed a particular point of pain, you come around again and pass it at a different altitude. And every year, without fail, I mailed a package. Not because I expected it to be received. After the second return, I knew it wouldn't be. After the third, I understood that the return itself had become a ritual, their ritual, a ceremony of rejection performed with the strange precision of people who are absolutely certain they are right. My mother's texts became slightly more elaborate over the years, as though she was refining her craft. Year 3. We don't accept gifts from strangers. Year 4. The same. Year 5. Please stop sending these. It is inappropriate. Year 6. No text at all, just the box returned with a postcard of the Christ the Redeemer statue. Whether that was intentional symbolism or just the postcard they had on hand, I never determined. Year 7. Strangers don't get to pretend. Year 8. Nothing. Year 9. We have a son. His name is not yours. That one I had to read 4 times before I accepted that I'd read it correctly. Year 10. I didn't know if I would send anything. I sat with the question for most of November and all of December. My therapist, a compact, wire-spectacled woman named Dr. Yevdokia, who had the habit of letting silences grow in her office the way other people let plants grow, with patient attention and no apology, asked me what I was hoping for. I told her I didn't know anymore. She said that was probably the most honest thing I'd said in 6 months. I sent the package anyway, a bottle of wine and a photograph of me at 29, standing in front of the sea. It came back. No text this time. 10 years, 10 packages, 10 returns. And then came year 11. I need to tell you what changed, because it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a letter of reconciliation or a mediating phone call from a cousin or a priest. It wasn't even really about forgiveness in the traditional sense, the kind where someone says the right words in the right order and a door swings open. What changed was something quieter and much harder to explain, which is that I stopped trying to explain myself and started trying to understand them. This is the part people get wrong about estrangement. They treat it as a mystery with a solution, a locked box with a single correct key. But the box my parents had built wasn't locked. It was sealed. Sealed by years of shame, not mine, theirs. Because what I'd uncovered with those bank statements wasn't just Faustino's theft. It was my father's silence about it, my mother's cooperation with that silence. And the only way they could live with themselves inside that story was to make me the transgressor. If I was wrong, they were right. If I was the disrespectful son, they were the wronged parents. The architecture of their self-image required my exile. I understood this, finally, at 31, sitting in Dr. Yevdokia's office on a gray Wednesday afternoon, with rain making the windows look like they were weeping in slow motion. I understood it not as an intellectual proposition. I'd understood it intellectually for years. But as a felt thing, a body knowledge, the kind that settles into your chest differently than thoughts do. And I understood something else. I didn't need them to admit it. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't even need them to believe, in any formal sense, that they'd been wrong. What I needed was to send one more package, not for them, not as a tactic, not as a pressure campaign, but as a full stop, a period at the end of a sentence I'd been writing for a decade. So I spent 3 months preparing Year 11's package. I drove to Petrolina in August, not to see them, just to be in the geography of my childhood for a few days, to walk the streets I'd walked at 7 and 12 and 16, to eat the food that still tasted like before everything, to sit by the Rio São Francisco in the late afternoon when the light comes off the water in long copper sheets that make you believe, briefly, that everything that ever happened to you was exactly the right preparation for whatever comes next. While I was there, I found a woman named Doña Zilmara who lived 3 streets over from my parents' house and who had known my father since he was a boy. She was 91 and moved through her house with the deliberate calm of someone who has outlived every urgency. Over 3 afternoons of coffee and bread and a rum cake she made from a recipe she refused to write down, she told me things about my father that I had never known. She told me about his own father, a man named Onofre, who had been brilliant and brutal in equal measure. The kind of father who taught you everything about the world and nothing about tenderness. She told me how Drago, at 17, had cried for 3 days when Onofre died and never spoken about it again. She told me how my father had always been terrified of being seen to be wrong, not because he was vain, but because being wrong, in the architecture of his childhood, had consequences. "He loves you," she said on the 3rd afternoon, without preamble or apparent connection to anything we'd been discussing. "He's just never learned that love and pride can exist in the same body at the same time." I drove back to Recife and I built the package. Inside, a hard drive. On the hard drive, a folder called Onofre. Inside the folder, everything I'd been able to find about my grandfather over the previous 2 years. Photographs digitized from the archives of 2 newspapers and a church registry in Juazeiro, letters he'd written during military service in 1962, a short film clip from a municipal event in 1971 where he appears for 11 seconds in the background, watching something off-screen with an expression that, and this is the thing that broke me when I first saw it, was exactly my father's expression. The one Drago got when he was trying not to feel something. There it was, inherited, crossing generations like a watermark. I also included a letter, not an apology, not an accusation, just a description of what I'd found, where I'd found it, and why I thought my father might want it. The last paragraph read, "I don't know if you'll open this. I've stopped needing you to. But I found your father's face in an archive, and it looked like yours, and I thought you should have it." That's all this is. I sealed it. I drove it to the post office. I paid for shipping. I went home and I cooked dinner and I watched something forgettable on streaming and I went to sleep. On the 31st of October, at 7:14 in the morning, my phone rang. Unknown number from a Petrolina area code. I let it ring. Voicemail. I listened to it in the kitchen while my coffee brewed, and what I heard was my father's voice. A voice I had not heard in 11 years. A voice that sounded both older and somehow younger than I'd imagined, as though grief had compressed it and expanded it simultaneously, saying my name. Just my name. And then a sound I had no precedent for. My father crying. He called 19 more times in the next 12 minutes. I picked up on the 20th. He said, "Where did you find these?" Not a question. A statement of shock wearing a question's grammar. I told him about Doña Zilmara, about the archives, about the 3 afternoons of rum cake and the 11-second clip and the expression on Onofre's face that was exactly his expression. He was silent for a long time, long enough that I checked twice to make sure the call was still connected. Then he said, "I didn't know he'd been photographed." "He had," I said. "He looked—" "I know," I said. Another silence. Then, "Your mother wants to talk to you." My mother got on the phone and said nothing for 15 seconds that felt like weather, like the particular suspended atmosphere before a storm breaks, when the air pressure changes and every living thing holds still. And then she said, in a voice I hadn't heard since I was 19 and had the flu, and she sat on the edge of my bed with her hand on my forehead, Meu filho. My son. 2 words. The entire architecture of a decade shifted by 2 words. Not because they solved anything, or explained anything, or erased anything, but because they acknowledged the most basic fact, that I existed, that I was hers, that the word stranger had always been a lie she'd told herself in the only way she knew how to survive the shame of having told it. We talked for 4 hours that morning. Not everything was resolved. Most things weren't. My father never said he was sorry. Not that day, and I don't know if he ever will, and I've had to make peace with the possibility that he won't, because the pride that made him a difficult father is the same pride that made him remarkable in other ways, and people don't partition those things cleanly. My mother cried 3 times and changed the subject twice, and made a joke once that landed badly, and then apologized for the joke, which was the first time I'd ever heard her apologize for anything. Faustino, they told me, had died in 2024, heart failure. Neither of them had spoken to him in 2 years before that. That detail moved through me like something being set down after a long carry. I flew to Petrolina in November. I sat in the kitchen of the mustard yellow Colonial. The weather vane still spun in windless air. My mother smelled like vanilla, still, after all this time. That particular vanilla that I had only ever smelled in that house, which I realized then wasn't a product or a perfume, but something ambient, something embedded in the walls themselves by decades of specific living. My father showed me his study, where he'd put the photographs of Onofre on the wall above his desk. He didn't say anything about them. He just pointed and let me look. I looked for a long time. On the last night, after dinner, my father and I sat on the wraparound porch while my mother did dishes inside, and the sound of the water running was the sound of things continuing to exist despite everything. The stars over Petrolina's western edge were extraordinary, the kind you forget exist when you live in a city with ambient light. My father put his hand on the arm of my chair, not on my arm, on the arm of the chair, as though the wood could be an acceptable conductor of something too large for direct transmission. We didn't speak for 20 minutes. The weather vane turned and turned. Here is what I know, after all of it. The most dangerous form of love is the kind that has no language for its own failure. My father loved me with an intensity he'd never been taught to express, except through provision and silence. And when I threatened the story he needed to survive inside, his love had no syntax for the crisis, only the blunt instrument of exile. My mother followed, because following had always been safer than leading in the specific architecture of their marriage. Neither of them was a monster. Neither of them was a saint. They were people who had been broken in specific ways by specific forces, and who had, in turn, broken me in specific ways. And I had survived those breaks and built something in the fractures, which is all any of us ever really do. Year 11's package wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. It was a gesture of attention. I had stopped asking to be seen and started seeing instead. I had stopped sending them versions of myself, scarves, wine, photographs, and started sending them themselves, the parts they'd lost or never found, a father's face in an archive, an inheritance of expression, proof that they came from something real and specific that could be named and touched and held on a hard drive. And they had opened it, not because I had finally said the right thing, but because after 11 years of returning unopened boxes, they had finally become tired enough of exile to crack the seal on something true. Doña Zilmara died in January. I got the call from a neighbor of hers I'd exchanged numbers with. I drove to Petrolina for the funeral, and this time my parents came with me to the church. And this time, my father sat in the pew next to me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and neither of us moved away. That's worth more to me than 1,000 apologies. Not because apologies don't matter. They do. They are the architecture of repair. But because proximity is also a language. Shoulders touching in a pew for a woman who had given us back to each other without knowing that's what she was doing, That is a sentence I will read for the rest of my life. My father called me last week, not because anything had happened, just to talk. He'd been reading the Lispector novel. Yes, the one from year one, the first edition I'd sent in the green craft paper box at 22, the box that had come back unopened. He'd kept it. He'd kept all of them. Every single returned package stored in the closet of the spare room, unopened but not discarded. When they finally opened Year 11's box, they opened all the others too. Everything I'd sent over a decade, waiting in that closet like letters in a language they hadn't yet learned to read. The burgundy scarf, he told me, still smelled like the tissue paper it had been wrapped in. He gave it to my mother. She wore it to Sunday Mass. If you found something here that felt like yours, if you recognized something in the specific shape of this particular silence, then press that like button like it owes you something and subscribe, because there are more stories where this one lived, and none of them will let you go quietly.